Welcome to the 5 Books, where each week we talk with a Jewish author about 5 books that are near and dear to them. My name is Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen, and today we have a really special episode for you. I'll be talking with Allegra Goodman about her new novel of interconnected short stories, This Is Not About Us, about a contemporary, multi-generational Jewish family.
I started with this gathering of a family at the sickbed of one of the older relatives, and I started thinking, even as I was writing that story, that I would love to pursue the different members of the family. The book grew like a tree. The woman on the sickbed, her 2 elderly sisters, her sons, their wives, their children. It just organically grew in that way.
Allegra Goodman is a writer of extraordinary range and precision. Across novels and stories, she's written about faith, ambition, family, science, history, and the quiet negotiations of everyday life, always with clarity, wit, and deep compassion for her characters. This Is Not About Us brings all of that together, following the Rubinstein family over many years through moments that feel small until suddenly they don't. Allegra Goodman's many books include among them Sam, a Jenna's book club pick, Paradise Park, Kaaterskill Falls, a National Book Award finalist, and Isola, a Reese's book club pick. This episode was recorded live in front of an audience in a joint event for subscribers to New Reads, a project from Jewish Book Council that brings remarkable Jewish literature straight to your door. This Is Not About Us by Allegra Goodman is the New Reads pick for February. You'll note we have some questions from audience members for Allegra at the end of the episode. Regular listeners might notice that Allegra is our very first repeat guest. We were delighted to have had Allegra on the show last March to talk about her book, Isola. If you haven't heard it, you can go back to Allegra's first episode on the show and hear her talk about her Jewish childhood in Hawaii, reading Daniel Deronda, the relevance of 1984 by George Orwell, and more. This also means that we've tweaked our format a bit for today. We'll hear about a book in conversation with her latest novel. Allegra picked The Family Markowitz, her serial novel published in 1996.
I had often thought over the years I would love to revisit that structure of linked stories or a story cycle that can be read as a novel. I would call it like a serial novel, in fact, in which I could explore the different generations from within their points of view. And so this book is my answer to that. Of course, 30 years have passed. A lot has changed in the world, in American Judaism, in the people themselves. And, I was just eager to explore that.
And we'll hear about a book Allegra changed her mind about.
I was sort of force marching myself through The Portrait of a Lady and hating every minute of it.
All that and so much more coming up next. Allegra, we are thrilled to have you here and welcome to the 5 Books.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be back.
So you open your book with a note to the reader, so I want to just share a little bit of that. You say, "Dear reader, when I finished writing this book, I sent it to my 22-year-old daughter. She emailed me. I like how you labeled the document, This Is Not About Us, to reassure the family. No, that's the title, I replied. Oh, you called it that, but the book is about our family, she asked later on the phone. Not at all. It's a work of fiction. It's about a family, not our family. Uh-huh, she said. No, really. And then you end with, I admit that fiction can contain a grain of truth. In these pages, you might recognize someone you know, your grandmother, your child, your sister. You might even see something of yourself. If this happens, do what I do. Deny everything. Enjoy this book about other people." I love that. Tell me why you called it This Is Not About Us.
One of the pieces in the book is called This Is Not About Us, so the original title came from that piece. But I liked the idea of sort of playing with, people say, and it's true, that in fiction you can often recognize something of yourself or something familiar to you, maybe people you know. And of course, in real life, we don't like to admit these things, especially when our experience is troublesome or complicated or embarrassing, So I decided to just play with that idea with the title.
The book, This Is Not About Us, is actually 17 interconnected stories. I think 6 of them have been published in The New Yorker and 2 others in other literary journals. We're going to talk more about this as we go on, but what led you to the Rubinstein family, and what do you like about these linked stories about one family?
Yeah, so I started this book more than 10 years ago, maybe 12 or 15 years ago, with the first piece in the book, which is called Apple Cake. I started there with this gathering of a family at the sick bed of one of the older relatives. And I started thinking, even as I was writing that story, that I would love to pursue the different members of the family. And from Apple Cake, the book grew like a tree. And the woman on the sick bed, her two elderly sisters, Sylvia and Helen, her sons, Steve and Dan, who are middle-aged, their wives, their children, who are the third generation, who are the grandchildren of the family. And it just organically grew in that way.
Book 1, a book that is in conversation with your latest work, The Family Markowitz by Allegra Goodman, published in 1996. We asked you a book that is in conversation with your latest work, and you chose your book, The Family Markowitz, which you published about 30 years ago. Tell me the ways that you see your two books as in conversation.
Well, I had for a long time been thinking I would really like to write a latter-day Family Markowitz. I was a young, very, very young writer when I wrote The Family Markowitz. I was in my early 20s when I started that book, and, as a young mother when I finished it, and it was just about exactly 30 years ago that it was published. And that is the story of the Markowitz clan, the matriarch, Rose Markowitz, who's somewhat pixelated, her two grown sons, middle-aged sons, Edward and Henry, Ed's, long-suffering wife, Sarah, his children. Henry does not have children. But, it again had this sort of three generations of this family. And in that book, I talk about how the family interacts with each other, but also how they manage different life cycle events. There's a wedding in that book. There are Jewish holidays in that book, a Passover story in that book that's really central to it. And it was very much about a sort of recognizable and affiliated Jewish family, not super observant, but, sort of conservative / reform / but with variations within them, and how they negotiate life in America. And in contrast to my first novel, Kaaterskill Falls, which is about quite an observant Jewish community, and quite a less assimilated Jewish community, much more of a separatist community. And I had often thought over the years I would love to revisit that structure of linked stories, or a story cycle that can be read as a novel. I would call it like a serial novel, in fact, with a larger narrative arc in which I could explore the different generations from within their points of view, from the inside. And so this book is my answer to that. Of course, 30 years have passed. A lot has changed in the world, in American Judaism, in the people themselves. And, I was just eager to explore that.
Well, I got a chance to reread it as well, and hadn't read it since it first came out. So, looking at it through a different lens as a reader also was fun too. You mentioned that they both sort of start off with a character on their deathbed. They both end on a hopeful note with a wedding in the family Markowitz. There's a new baby, and this is not about us. So it does really echo that structure. What do you see as the distance between the two books?
Part of the distance comes from me because I'm older. So when I wrote The Family Markowitz, I had two little children, like a toddler and a baby. And when I wrote This Is Not About Us, I started it with sort of 4 almost grown children. I now have 4 grown children, and I'm a grandmother with 3 little grandchildren. And so I would say that my perspective naturally deepened because, I'm both a parent and a grandparent now. I've also sort of matured as a writer. I think that my style has somewhat changed in the two books. There's still humor in this one. There's satire. There's some funny moments, but I think the colors in This Is Not About Us are kind of richer and maybe darker because I've evolved and I've written many more books, and I think I've matured, I would say, as a writer.
I note that shift, from the satirical to a little more earnest, but still funny and playful. I am also thinking about the fact that both books really center older characters' voices, and I wonder how you approach that differently, or how you think about depicting older characters differently as you've gotten older?
It's funny because when I was a really young writer, I actually felt very comfortable writing quite old characters. I think it was because of the distance from me. So Rose Markowitz, who's in her 80s in the Family Markowitz, is really kind of the star of the show in a lot of ways, partly because she thinks she's the star of the show, but also because I enjoyed her voice so much. I enjoyed writing her so much. And for me, writing the younger characters was more challenging when I was younger and closer to their age. And I think one difference with this book is that I felt more comfortable about writing the really young characters. Like Lily, for example, is a major character who is a very young girl. I also really enjoyed revisiting some of the Jewish holidays in this book and talking about Jewish practice. So there is a story about Yom Kippur. Actually, there's a story about Yom Kippur in the Family Markowitz too, but very different. There is, again, a Passover story, but in this case, it has sort of like two Seders and quite a different take on the holiday. There's a bris in this book, which there wasn't in the Family Markowitz, and a bat mitzvah. So, I enjoyed, I find the American Jewish community to be a very, very rich and complex subject. There's just so much material there.
There is. In that vein, in the Family Markowitz, you take on, I guess, somewhat obliquely, the way that Israel is a charged and polarizing subject for American Jews. The character, Ed, is a professor specializing in the Middle East and terrorism. And, he's sort of set against his daughter Miriam's father-in-law-to-be, whose views are more strident / right-wing. Reading it this many years later, it's pretty striking how familiar that polarization feels. And I wonder if you would approach that dynamic differently now or at all.
Yeah, so interesting. I mean, the Family Markowitz was written before 9/11, for example. And on occasion, I've wondered about Ed Markowitz, the so-called expert on terrorism, and how he would respond to, more recent events. In some ways, I would say in some ways for him, it was a more innocent time. There were some things that happened that were unimaginable for the characters in the Family Markowitz. And the world has evolved. At the same time, as you mentioned, that struggle has been constant between the more right-wing voice and the more liberal voice, that I played with in the Family Markowitz. I should add that I wrote This Is Not About Us before the events in Israel of October 7th. So, this book, it's funny, as you know, the last time I came to speak to you, I was speaking about a historical novel set in the 16th century. And I call this novel a historical novel as well, because it's set in 2015 to 2017 about. And, so much has happened since then.
Book 2, A Book You Changed Your Mind About, The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. So for the second book, I asked you a book that you changed your mind about. And you said The Portrait of a Lady, and you said you changed your mind about it while you were reading it. So if you could tell us a little bit about the book for listeners who aren't as familiar with it, and then what you meant by changing your mind about it while you were reading it.
Yes, The Portrait of a Lady is a masterpiece by Henry James. And it is a very slow-moving book. And Henry James is an incredible novelist. It was written kind of during the Gilded Age period, and Henry James writes with very, very long, complex sentences with many subtleties. And he's very much a novelist of character. And when I first read the book, which was in college, I found it interminable and glacially slow. I had, by chance, ended up in a tutorial in college with a Henry James specialist who assigned this book, and I couldn't believe it. I was just like, and I love to read, but I was, I think, 18 years old, and I just had no patience for this book. And I was sort of force marching myself through The Portrait of a Lady and hating every minute of it. Because this girl who had named Isabel Archer, who came from America to England, and it's this marriage plot, but it's the opposite of Jane Austen, which is bouncy and cheerful and moves, right along. This just full of internal monologues and analysis of what seemed to me a rather trivial decision between suitors. And one night in my freshman dorm, I had a terrible, terrible cold. And it was one of those colds where you just can't sleep because you're so uncomfortable. And this was, in the days before the internet. I had no cell phone with me. I couldn't start scrolling in my bed or watching a movie in my bed as kids can these days. So what did I do? I picked up The Portrait of a Lady, the Norton edition, and I started, just reading it because I couldn't sleep and there was nothing else for me to do. I was just so miserable. And I got about halfway through and I had a conversion experience where I realized how brilliant this book was and how incredibly moving it was. And that what I had thought was trivial and sort of affected and horribly slow moving and really tried my patience was actually so compelling once everything was all set up. And I think, honestly, I was able to change my mind about Portrait of a Lady just because getting so sick slowed me down at last to the pace of that book so that I could appreciate it. And I just, I kept reading. I read most of the night and, I ended by absolutely loving it and appreciating Henry James for his mastery and his insight into people and feelings. I got, I guess, to the molten heart of that book eventually by finally slowing down.
That is a silver lining of a bad cold. Did that change how you approached reading other books?
Well, after that, I was sort of converted to Henry James, and I realized that he is an incredible artist. And I think my whole life I've started to learn to be patient as a reader and a writer. And maybe it taught me a little patience with other books as well.
So much of what James depicts are power dynamics of gender and class and the fine-tuned ways the characters manipulate and respond to those circumstances. Those are ideas that you're somewhat less preoccupied with. How do you think about those concerns for your characters?
Oh, I'm interested in it too. I'm interested in all of those themes as well. I do have a somewhat lighter touch than he does, but often. And I think my sentences are a bit shorter, but I'm very interested in the way characters manipulate each other. I'm very interested in sort of psychological depths of people and getting inside them. And I guess that getting inside them part, I really responded to that as an artist because I like to do that.
The book was published serially as well. And then he went, I think, 1880 to 1881. And then he went back and made revisions and it came out later.
Famously, yes.
Famously. And
could not leave well enough alone, that man.
Yeah. So I know that you've said that getting feedback from your readers as you've published your short stories has been helpful to you. I wonder how that's impacted a final version of a published serial novel.
Yes, as I was publishing some of the stories in this book, especially in the New Yorker, readers would write to me and say, I'd like to hear, I want more about Lily, or what happened to so and so. And those messages, or just something, this spoke to me, or this reminded me of my mother, or, this reminded me of my daughter-in-law. And that those messages really encouraged me to keep going and keep exploring. I will also say that when I was in the late stages of putting this book all together and thinking about the sort of the narrative arc of the book, my editor, Whitney Frick, said to me, I feel like there's a character who's neglected in this book, that all the cousins of her generation have a story about them, except for Pam. And so my story Dealbreaker, I wrote because Whitney asked me to see if I could explore Pam's consciousness and her situation as a middle-aged single woman with some domineering parents. And that turned into my story Dealbreaker, which was published just a couple weeks ago in the New Yorker. So, my editor also, and her response also influenced me as I was writing the book.
Book 3, a passage from a book that has stayed with you and changed how you think about things. This is a famous passage from one of John Keats's letters. It struck me what quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. I mean negative capability. That is, when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. So first I want to ask how and when you came across this passage, and did it stick with you from the get-go?
Yes, this is a famous passage from John Keats's letters. And Keats was a great, great poet. He wrote the famous odes, Ode on a Grecian Urn and To Autumn, which some of you may have like read in school and that kind of thing. And he died very, very, very young. So he was in his early 20s when he died. And I actually came across this passage in high school when I just got really interested in him. I read a biography of John Keats and I got interested in his poetry, which is exquisite. And also his letters, because he's an incredible letter writer. And he's a very excitable letter writer. I mean, he's the age of like a modern undergraduate when he's writing this. I think that passage comes from a letter he wrote in 1817. So we have to excuse him for saying when he talks about a man of literature, or, he uses the male pronouns. I don't think he conceived of women novelists or women poets so much, but, he was a man of his generation. But what really excited me about that passage, and what has excited so many people over the years, because it's very famous, is this idea that he develops there. And you can almost hear him thinking aloud as he's writing this letter to his friend, that the energy in art comes from disappearing, from the artist disappearing into other people's points of view and negating oneself. That's where the negative comes in. A kind of negation or dissolving of the artist. So in other words, the artist is not the stage manager, not the puppeteer holding the strings of the characters, but really inhabits the characters, performs through them. And that excited me tremendously, even as a, 14-year-old kid. And I realized that the work that I love so much, that the writers that I love most had that capability that he talks about. Shakespeare's the one he mentioned. If you look at fiction, I think somebody like Leo Tolstoy is capable of that. And of course, he lived after Keats, of course, had no way of knowing what Tolstoy was going to do. But Tolstoy was able in his novels to become an old man and a young girl and a drunken soldier and a general and a young boy who runs off to war, somebody dying of his wounds, somebody gambling his fortune away. He could be all of those things and all of those people. And, I thought, well, that's the life, that's what real art is. So I took that passage as a talisman and a way forward.
You started to say what stage managing a story does mean to you. Can you say a little bit more about what that is?
I think that, what Keats is talking about is just breaking away from this idea that a story is going to teach a lesson, or that, you're going to learn something from this story that is obvious and visible to all, that there might be a moral at the end or something like that. He's breaking away from what he considers a moralistic idea of storytelling. And, that's the powerful idea and has its purposes. But he's talking about the energy that comes from ambiguity, the energy and activity that comes from allowing the reader to make decisions and interpret. Whether the story is heartbreaking, whether it's funny, whether this character is right or wrong, it doesn't have to be obvious and set in stone by the writer.
Do you think that negative capability is something a writer can learn? Is it something they have or don't have or grow into?
I think negative capability is something a writer can aspire to and practice. How much can be learned might be a separate conversation.
And how did that shape the way you approach point of view in This Is Not About Us?
Well, when I take a point of view, as I do in this book, This Is Not About Us, I really inhabit it. I just commit fully to it. So I'm not myself. So if my protagonist is going to an art museum, I'm not writing about my own views of the art on the wall. I'm seeing that museum through her eyes. If I am writing about a grandmother going to her grandson's bris, I'm not giving you my opinions and my view of what this life cycle event is like. I am completely inhabiting the grandmother's point of view and seeing it through her eyes. So, as Sylvia does, she's upset that there aren't good flowers on the tables at this bris, That's Sylvia. That's not me. But, she is concerned about the name of this baby. What kind of name is this baby getting? That's Sylvia. That's not me. So it is very much like being an actor and performing a part in just trying to inhabit the character for the reader.
Do you feel like this idea of negative capability also shapes how you move through the world? Like, do you feel when it comes to issues like politics or Are you particularly well equipped to see multiple perspectives?
Oh no, I don't think I have any particular gift or that I've become sort of zen in my views of politics or any of that.
Book 4, the book you're reading now. Dickens the Enchanter, Inside the Explosive Imagination of the Great Storyteller by Peter Conrad.
Oh, what am I reading? I am actually reading a book about Charles Dickens's imagination. It's called Dickens the Enchanter. It's a newish book, and it's not a straightforward biography of Charles Dickens. It's a book about his working methods and how he came up with his characters. It's a book about how he was going through the process of very much what we're describing, how he inhabited his characters, how he named them, how he played with language. As you can tell, I'm a book nerd, and I like to read about the artists that I admire and think about their techniques. So that is actually the book I am literally reading today.
Book 5, the author's latest book, This Is Not About Us by Allegra Goodman. I'm really interested in the progression of your books from Sam, which is about a young girl, a rock climber, a coming-of-age story. Isola's sweeping historical fiction. Now, This Is Not About Us is, a recent history. They're so different, and yet these themes of isolation and community, to me, feel so strong in all of the stories. I'm wondering if you're conscious of returning to some of the same themes and told through different lenses.
Yes, I'm very conscious of that. And in fact, my book, Sam, which is about this 21st century young girl who's a boulderer growing up in North Shore of Massachusetts, and Isola, which is this historical novel about a young noblewoman who's marooned on an island in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and this one, which is about a family, but also includes some people trying to grow up within that family. Weirdly enough, I wrote them all around the same time, and they all overlapped each other. So I guess in some ways you could step back and say, I was really working on the same project in different modes, as you said, writing about an individual in a group, about being isolated and coming of age, about the pressures of sort of the social and cultural pressures on people, particularly young women. So yes, I think Isola and Sam both are sort of coming of age stories about young women. And I wrote those at the same time. And this book I was writing on Sundays, actually. I wrote it very slowly over a long period of time, just on Sunday mornings. And this book really has the most, the largest sort of family and people negotiating within a group, which has its challenges and opportunities.
Is it the characters that kind of speak to you, or what is it that draws you to tell each story the way that they're told?
The characters definitely speak to me, and therefore each of my projects has a different voice depending on what the story and the characters require. So Sam is told in this third person, very close point of view, and is very much in the mind and perspective of this young 21st century girl, while Isola is a first person narrative of this woman telling her story of survival on the island. But she's a noblewoman and she lives in the 16th century, so of course she doesn't sound anything like Sam. And then this book has a different voice altogether and includes the multiple voices of the quarreling and loving family, the older ones, the younger ones, all their aggravations. Certainly, this is the contemporary Jewish book.
And were there any characters in particular in this collection that maybe spoke a little more loudly to you, or you felt a little more pulled toward their stories?
I actually love them all so much. I can't choose. I felt called to them when I focused on each, but they were all really important to me. Somebody said, which is your favorite character? And I was sort of like, I love them all, including the grumpy ones, especially the grumpy ones. They just, and that, not to say that I would have patience in real life with all these people, but in my stories, I just adore them all and just loved working with them.
I read in an interview, you said about your process. You said it doesn't get easier. Often when I write a book, I go off in the wrong direction, and I can't just realize that after a few pages. I realize that after like 200 pages. The first time that happened to me was when I wrote my first novel. It was a serious crisis. I was like, I can't do this. I can't be a writer. And now it's just my process. Is that still, do you still go far off in those directions, or do you feel like you are a little closer to where you want to be?
With Sam, I definitely went through that process and wrote hundreds of pages that didn't end up in the book. So that that unfortunate part of the process was very much present with Sam. With Isola, I had a much better idea of the arc of the story and a very firm structure from the beginning, and did not have that experience. It was a challenging book to write and research, but I didn't go off on a tangent. And this one grew very gently and gradually, as families do. So I didn't experience that. There aren't like hundreds of pages about the Rubinsteins that, will never see the light of day.
I mean, you could tell so many more stories, so many more characters. I want to talk about one story in particular, Redemption Song. It's a Passover story. As you mentioned, those feature prominently in each book. This one centers on Dan and Steve, who are the two adult sons. You talk about how Dan runs his Seder like a drill sergeant. He hates it, but he's doing it the way it was when he was a child. And he balks when his kids, who are teens and young adults, want to inject anything new. He says, none of it was right. None of it was the way it should be. Dan grieved, not for a person or a place, but for the unbroken recitation of the passage out of Egypt. And then the second night they're at Steve's house, and it's the second Seder, and there are songs like Redemption Song by Bob Marley, and there are readings from Chana Senesh and Yehuda Amichai, and Dan is miserable at both Seders. And he and Steve have this moment where they remember their Holocaust survivor father correcting their reading into the middle of the night. And, it's very, very harsh. And Dan and Steve are at odds in this story, and it seems like it might go the way of their mother and aunt, Helen and Sylvia, who no longer speak. And then it ends, Dan and Steve were sidelined. They would return to dinner and more singing. They who had not suffered compared to other people. They who had grown up free. I felt that you hit that nerve so precisely, that knot of tradition, the weight of family, of guilt and trauma of children of Holocaust survivors, and that tension between preserving tradition and ritual in a way that is unbroken versus expanding ritual and allowing room for meaning making. And that's the story of contemporary Judaism. And I wonder just, A, if you want to say any more about that tension and depicting it that way, and also why it was important for you to place that conflict in the context of children of Holocaust survivors.
Well, I think that the Seders and the whole holiday is really about how do we remember what happened and how do we transmit that memory and be grateful? How do we re-experience something that happened outside of our experience before we were born, perhaps? It's such a beautiful goal and so impossible to achieve, right? And I was just really interested in thinking about that. And this is the generational sort of conflict that I see, in America. And, there's a line in that story where, Dan and Steve are remembering their father who was a survivor, and they're remembering how awful he made Passover. And it was like, and they say, they're thinking Passover meant a lot to him. And so he ruined it for everyone because it meant so much to him. And, the weight of that, it's sad. It's funny. It's ironic. I'm really interested, as you put it well, like in that knot of the generations. It's a knot that's strong. It's a knot that's fascinating and intricate. It's a knot with tension in it. It's really difficult. And that's my subject in that story. And to some extent, it's the subject of the book.
And why place it in the context of the children of Holocaust survivors?
Because I think this is a moment when, the Holocaust survivors are most, very old and not many left. And there's a transition to the children and the grandchildren, and that trauma and that experience is shifting. And I was interested in talking, and that's and that's an American moment, right? Like not just a Jewish one, but of the people who came here, where they had so much freedom and opportunity and they were able to live good lives, but brought with them, it's the sadness of the losses that they had experienced. What happens to that sadness? Where does it go?
I wanted to ask about some of the inside baseball references, if you will, and, Jewish references that are so niche and so appreciated. You talk about the difference between Melanie and Dan, who are married. The difference in their upbringing is that, she had gone to Camp Ramah, which is a conservative camp, and he had gone to Maimonides, which is an Orthodox day school. Or there's a character, Wyatt, who wants to make a human chain around a tree. And then by way of explanation, he worked 3 summers at Eden Village Camp. So do you see those as just kind of Easter eggs for the in-the-know readers?
You can take it. I don't know. I mean, an Easter egg in my book? That's shocking. Shocking. I don't celebrate Easter.
An afikomen, if you will.
I did it because it seemed real to me, because this is my life and my culture and my community. And I know those places, I live in Boston. I've spent time in LA, I have been to those Havdalah services with the Debbie Friedman melodies that go on and on, My children went to pluralistic day schools, write what you know, right? So, I think the general reader can enjoy, Eden Village, the name says it all, but people who have actually been to Eden Village might have a little extra enjoyment of those comments. And I think that fiction, it lives in particularities. It lives in detail. And so if you can be detailed, and if you do know the characters and the community that well, enjoy it and let the reader enjoy it with you.
Yeah. You've lived with these characters for so long, as you said. I think you said started writing it 12 years ago, 15 years ago, over a decade. Now that you've finished writing, do those characters recede a little bit? Do they continue to pop up? Or how do you think about them once you're done writing?
They pop up because readers talk about them now. It's sort of like I've handed them over to the readers, and then the readers tell me, their response. I got a message, for example, after my story Dealbreaker was published just a couple weeks ago, a message from a woman who began, I am Helen. I am Helen, and I want to send your story to my grown children because they do not listen to me. And I thought, you really are Helen. So yes, my characters still live and breathe, and they correspond with me, in fact.
Amazing.
I think I may have said everything I have to say about my characters, but my readers are still talking, which is exactly what you hope for, right?
Yes, for sure. Now that you're handing it over to the readers, I want to hand it over to the listeners, everyone who's on the call. We can take some questions. Oh, this is from Rachel Hillman. Do you have a sense of when you are writing to a Jewish audience versus a broader secular audience, depending on the book? How does that influence your writing?
That's a great question. I write primarily for a broad audience, and I imagine that some people, that audience will be Jewish. And so I don't really worry too much about that somebody wouldn't understand something because they weren't Jewish or that sort of thing. And I started doing that very young. When I wrote Kaaterskill Falls, which is just about deeply observant Jewish people in a community from Washington Heights who summer in the Catskills, there is a lot of religion in that book and shul going and, ritual in that book. But even at the time when I was very, very young, it was my first novel, it's my early 20s, I thought of that book as for everybody. I didn't think of it as just because it was about Jewish people, that it was for Jewish readers only. I think that Jewish readers understood it perhaps a little differently, but I always thought of it as for the world, ambitious as I was.
Okay, Susan Kleiman says, you mentioned that you've lived in different kinds of communities. What drew you to write about Kaaterskill Falls back when you did, and how did you immerse yourself in that world to write about it authentically?
Yeah, so people often ask me that because I grew up in Honolulu, and they're sort of like, what kind of books did you read? What kind of research did you do? And actually, I did no research for that book because my mother's family had a house up in Tannersville. and that they went to every summer. And my family from Hawaii used to go to that community every summer until I was 14. So I was quite young when I stopped going, but I remembered it all vividly. So I went and davened in that synagogue, and I saw those people, and I played with their children. And I was, as a small child, already a participant observer there. And so I just simply drew upon my memories of what I experienced in Tannersville to create the world of Kaaterskill Falls.
I wonder if you were setting a story in that kind of community again, do you feel like you would go back and do different kinds of research now?
Oh, yeah, I would have to, because, that world that I remembered is, changed, and it doesn't exist anymore. I was capturing a moment in time. And also, of course, I'm different, so I would have to do a different kind of research.
Wonderful. Allegra, thank you so much for this book, for your generosity in talking about it so openly with us, for returning to the 5 books. It's really been such a privilege.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today for the 5 books. Our guest today was Allegra Goodman talking about her book, This Is Not About Us. You can find a link to the book and all the others Allegra discussed in our show notes. If you're interested in learning more about Jewish Book Council and the New Reads book subscription box, you can find a link in our show notes or head to newreads.org, NUREADS.org. I'm Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. Our producer is Odelia Rubin, editorial and website support from Amelia Merrill, music by Dove Rosenblatt and Blue Dot Sessions, art by Elad Lifshitz of the Dove Abramson Studio. Thank you for putting this event together to the incredible team at New Reads and Jewish Book Council, Jamie Batesh Carter, Evie Sapphire Bernstein, Miri Pomerantz Dauber, and Naomi Firestone Teeter. And an extra special thank you to Odelia, our producer, for making this all happen.